Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. In today's episode, we have a very special guest, Mr. Kasper Vinthers, joining us from Denmark. Kasper was very highly recommended by our previous show guest, Andre Houdet. In his episode, he spoke very highly of how Kasper helped him bust through a long-standing strength plateau whilst also managing some of his niggles coming from his CrossFit training. And he's hit several PRs and obviously gone to the games since then. So Kasper definitely knows his stuff and has got great results at the highest level. We get into the weeds on training muscles long and short, some interesting revelations about rest periods that a lot of people are getting wrong, and how to really get strong and how CrossFitters sometimes miss the mark. So stay tuned for plenty of golden nuggets. But before we get into it, don't forget to click the link in the description box below to register your interest and get some Lunge and Lift listener exclusive bonuses for Rob's strength formula, which is your answer to the strength and muscle building equation. As always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website to download your free guide to movement mechanics. WIT-Fitness, please use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your WIT kit. And also Hydro, use our discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. All right, let's get into it. Kasper, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
If people haven't heard about you, could you give us a quick overview as to who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me on. First and foremost, I'm 33 years of age, and I live in Copenhagen, Denmark, where I co-own and run a gym called Nordic Performance Training. It's basically a personal training facility where we are currently 3 trainers who are all physical therapists by profession. So my professional life is revolved around managing the business and then helping people out with everything related to, just call it, I like when we're phrasing things in English because I can call it resistance training instead of only strength training, because we can use it for so much more than just getting stronger. But yeah, and then I really try to find times to further educate myself in the progress. But basically what I do is I'm a physical therapist who provides personal training. That's like my catalyst in how I help people out with either quote unquote fixing their problems or the things they're trying to achieve, or the things they want to get out of training if they have a specific goal or something. So that's been the last 5 years. We've been building our gym and our business. Started with basically nothing, just a very small gym with a lot of used equipment. Took out our savings and betted it all, and now we have what is the highest ranking personal training and physical therapy gym in Denmark. So we're pretty pleased with the time frame we managed to achieve that. It's been quite hard, but very giving as well.
That's awesome. And I think it's a great combination that's becoming more common nowadays, where you have the physical therapy, or we say physiotherapy here, and personal training or strength coaching. How did that come to be? Like, what was your route into both those qualifications?
Growing up, I played a lot of like soccer and or football, you call it in England. Yeah. I played a lot of football, and I liked the being in the gym. I found a lot of joy I just love training. And then physical therapy is physiotherapy is just a very natural way to go here. You can either study sports science or physical therapy basically here. So that's what I just went into naturally. So I've been working some years in more traditional, like, clinical setting, and I needed a bit more, maybe from an egotistical standpoint, more like real quote unquote strength training. because that's, as I said in the beginning, that's my catalyst for helping people. It's not it's not the thing that just works in physical therapy, but it's what I'm good at. So we went that route, and instead of calling it physical therapy, we call it performance training, because that kind of attracts the clients that we like to work with, because they see the word training, and they expect both an environment that is inviting for like being physical active, and it's the way for them to get better, improve, and also improve their performance. Maybe not necessarily in the context of being like a CrossFit Games athlete or anything like that, but just it's a much cooler way to approach training than just being more rehab focused. Even though that may be the goal, rehab.
What I love about that is I think where you've then got such a like decent background in training yourself, combining then that the side of physio with the side of training, just you kind of see the practical applications of the, say, the rehabby stuff that you're, say, prescribing or whatever, and then putting it into a like a practical program. Because I know the physios that I recommend people to go to over here are all physios that train and they all lift, because then they have the right, this person wants to get back to lifting, this is probably going to be what they want to do, rather than, okay, let me just fix you back to zero. So no, we want to go to zero and then beyond.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And sometimes when you are very into training, you sometimes forget that not all physical physiotherapists are really into training, which is also fine, because we also need to have physios that can help people maybe that are not interested in training. Maybe more in terms of speaking the same language, like we live in like our little bubble here, where most of the clients we see, maybe 80%, 90, 70%, whatever, they are in some way, shape or form already somewhat experienced in training, or they at least know that it's a good way to go. So yeah, we have our own little niche bubble of people. At least I have, that's basically more the avatar of clients I have. If I have to describe the person I work with the most, it's people who already love training, but they need help in navigating their thoughts and feelings around training, as well as getting a healthy structure and understanding a structure in terms of programming or training, and how to progress efficiently and auto-regulate their training on both daily and long-term basis, instead of receiving physiotherapy. They need guidance. That makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. I think that word receiving is perfect, because a lot of people go to physiotherapy and expect the results to be given to them. Whereas when you use the word training rather than receiving, the onus, the burden is on them to do the work. So they get guidance, but they have to put in the reps to actually get the result and to fix themselves. And I think that's a really important mindset shift. And I think why a lot of people go from manual therapy or physiotherapy towards training, because they realize that you can treat people and make them feel better short term, but to get the long term results, you have to empower them to sort of take responsibility for their own body. So I really, really like that.
And it's not that I'm not trying in any way to bash like manual therapy at all. I'm not good at it, so we don't really even have a treatment table. But it, as you said, it can provide some relief or whatever, and create some therapeutic alliance. But I think it's quite ironic, the word, let's use the American word, like physical therapy. Therapy, we don't expect to go through, let's say, a therapist and just have them fix our problems. We know that you get some tools to work through your thoughts and whatever, and the physical part, of course, should be some way, shape, or form an active approach instead of a passive approach. Whereas the passive could be something we are like sprinkling on top of that, and that, in my opinion, and so the word it's quite ironic that most people associate physical therapy with receiving passive treatments when the word is physical therapy. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I totally agree. And what do you think the unique perspective you've got from being able to see both sides of the equation how has that impacted your approach, would you say?
I think that the best things I've learned from working in a traditional setting and going through I don't know what you call it in English, but like the rotations, like internships, being at hospitals and nursing homes. Like I have the entire spectrum of people I've worked with, and developed maybe some soft skills in terms of understanding different populations and solving their problems, and knowing how to ask the right questions, and yeah, being active listener, and maybe, and it's gonna sound like a douchey word, or like but persuade people into being more active in their approach. Because that's almost like when you're selling, but you know the product is good.
Yeah.
I don't think persuasion is a bad word, but maybe help people associate physical therapy with being physical. Because I think a lot of trainers, they come out and need to help. You get especially in the beginning, if you haven't found maybe a niche or the one thing you're working with, you're gonna get a whole lot of different types of personalities, maybe even different kind of cultures and whatever, who all have a very different perspective on how they need to receive their help or get help. But it also, as I talked about in the beginning, can be from an egotistical perspective. It can be kind of it can tear on you being in an environment that invites this more fragile and passive approach, which is why we opened our own facility with the words Nordic and training, where people, they expect to receive training instead of having to persuade as much.
I think what you said there about how before you kind of found like your niche and you had your soft skills that you gained from dealing with different avatars, different types of people, that's priceless. Because the thing is like, even though you might have your avatar now who might say be a CrossFit athlete or like a high performing person, they once were probably someone that wasn't that. So they might still have traits of these other people. So even though they have this facade of being, I'm a go-getting like CrossFit athlete, but deep down they might actually need a softer approach to the thing to actually get them to buy in. And that's like what I found over the years. Like I've worked in a lot of commercial facilities with like personal training, and like I've dealt with so many different people over the years that now when I work in a more group environment, it doesn't really matter who's in front of me. I meet them where they're at, because as soon as I've had like a sentence or two with someone, I kind of can judge, okay, cool, this is how I'm going to have to approach this person. I don't necessarily change my personality. I might tone it down a little bit, or I might increase a little bit based on that individual. But I think where you've gained those soft skills, I think hence then why obviously your business has grown so much, because then you've been able to meet everyone where they're at and provide them with results.
Yeah, and I think that's a very a good way you put it, in terms of like, sort of where they've been and where they are now, and that everyone is always on like a spectrum of where they are in their career, and even high level athletes are still regular people. I think sometimes people have this perception that they're just machines, but they still need to navigate in this whole niche of training, being just a regular person, and sometimes like just being good at understanding everything. Like one thing is just like what we're good at as trainers should be, of course, the programming, the rep schemes, all that kind of stuff. But it's if you don't really, like, we're still working with people, not machines. So, and that's also why, like, I believe that all the AI stuff and that's coming up now and all, it can make great programs, most definitely at one point, like create some algorithms and whatever. But I don't think we can ever replace originality and the understanding of people, where they come from and where they want to go. And
it's the personal part in personal training for us over here, really. And that's, I think we get so focused on the training side of things that we do forget you have got a person in front of you, and sometimes they're not made to lift 87%. You might need to build to a heavy 6 of the day at an RPE, say 6 or 7, because you haven't got it in you for that heavy lift of the day. But that's the thing. We can look at the individual in front of us and say, right, today you're not there, and they might think they're there, but we can see, especially when you see people like week in and week out and so forth, you can see traits, you can see where their energy levels are low, and they might be putting on a facade, but you just can see their performance just isn't what it normally is. And that's where I think, going into the AI stuff, like as you say, it's going to be great at, I think, assisting the industry, but it won't take over the industry, because we are people at the end of the day, and until they've got the empathetic side of stuff, which probably will come and we'll be fucked. It will, and we'll be proper fucked.
Sex robots will take over the world. That's my theory.
Like stuff.
Hopefully not in our lifetime, but we'll see. Moving on. We were saying just before we started recording that we first came across you through Andre Houdet, and he came on our podcast probably a couple of years ago now and spoke very highly of you and the fact that you'd helped him bust through a strength plateau that he'd been struggling with for a little bit of time. Could you tell us how you came to meet Andre and what the process of working with him has been like?
So in keeping it short on terms of how we came in contact was, I was, now he's doing the team with no shortcuts, and they're really like smashing it. Yeah. And he, the other guy on the team, Julian, I helped his wife for quite a long time, getting back from an injury. And as we talked about, she's basically the perfect avatar of who I often train with. Like she used to be a CrossFitter, training twice a day, and navigating being a person that's not training twice a day and living a more quote unquote regular life, finding joy in that, and getting back to what she wanted, whatever. So she had success with the training, and I believe Andre heard about us and me through her and Julian, and he had been, as my understanding is, like, Andre has been training quite a bit of years up to going to the games, like always being outside like that bubble where he didn't really see him going up the leaderboard, but he's developed so many skills in CrossFit, and was already a very good athlete before he came to the games, obviously. But he had what he felt was what was holding him back was injuries and his strength levels. So he kind of took it as he took a wild card and contacted me in terms of if I could see if I could help him, because he's seen it through Instagram and he heard it through acquaintances or his training partner and his wife. So we just basically started out with how I always do it is just I have maybe some type of template that we start our training with, and I use the way he moves, his performance, like more like a GPP or what I call a hypertrophy phase maybe to begin with, and we often see where his weaknesses are in how he moves and how he generates force and all that kind of stuff. So we tried really scaling all of his trainings to his weakest links, and what he's very good at is being very honest on improving the things that prevents him from progressing in his sport, because he had hit a lot of plateaus just trying to be so specific in his training, because his goal was maximal strength. So he had been advised and thought to himself through all the literature he had read that he had to really hit high percentages all the time. And he was always sprinting towards like a peak goal of strength, like doing squat cycles, whatever. But in my opinion, and it's also something we can talk about in terms of like hypertrophy, not necessarily blocks or phases of blocks, but incorporating that into training as a way of having like peaks and valleys, in terms of you cannot peak all the time. We instead, and it's the same approach I use for beginners, or that regular avatar I talked about in the beginning. We try to find the baseline of where he is, where there's no pain, where he feels like his fatigue levels are low and he can produce a good amount of force on a daily basis, instead of being the type of person where my squat PR is 200 on when the stars are perfectly aligned, and and I warm up for 90 minutes. We try to find a baseline level where we could make those small increments of progression, and never really sacrificing getting his weakest links improved. So build a solid foundation, and not really trying to chase that glass ceiling of load progression, what I like to call it. So build a base and then a higher ceiling for progress, or a longer runway of progression, instead of being so focused on load. So my philosophy is your strength training just needs to be heavy enough. It doesn't need to be as heavy as possible. And that's something where we talked a lot about thresholds. Whereas if you come above, that's the same with hypertrophy training. If you reach above the threshold of maybe volume of tension, or stimulating the nervous system to create more force, you've done your job for the day. But if you're an athlete like Andre, like we all know, effort is not the thing that was holding him back. It was organization of the training. If it would make Andre better to train 12 hours a day, he would do it. And of course, because he's so focused on a goal, he was just maybe beating himself up too hard. So we pulled everything back and used what has maybe been coined as hypertrophy training, as a way of like quote unquote resetting the system and getting a good baseline, so he didn't experience pain from his elbows and knees and whatever had been the stuff that was holding him back.
That's brilliant.
So
we just did a episode on the gaps in CrossFit as a training system, and the fact that if you do specialize really heavily into CrossFit, there are some movement qualities that do get missed. And I think if you don't mind sharing, it would be really useful for the listeners to understand what his gaps in his GPP were when he started working with you, considering that he's a full-time athlete going to the games. He's doing all the training he can, very intelligent as a coach as well, but still there were some relatively fundamental pieces missing, which were leading to his niggles and injuries. Could you share with us what those were? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are going through a similar thing themselves.
Yeah. So it's always pretty like multi-factorial. This wasn't really like one or two things, but just experience in the fact that we have different tools than just the specific exercises that looks like the sport, quote unquote, like the barbell lifts and high percentages and all that kind of stuff. We scaled that back to the stuff that didn't really hurt. So, and a good example would be he had a lot of elbow pain, which he had seeked out help for quite a bit of years, and having a lot of like passive like stretching and mobility stuff. What we did instead is, instead of always trying to, as we talked about in the beginning, get that quick fix, we tried to solve this most structural problem. Because when you're always doing the same, like everything is rolled around a barbell or a bar you're holding on to, your body kind of gets molded in some position that, of course, you can tolerate it, but you doing the same thing over and over at somewhat high intensities can maybe beat you up a little bit. So instead of doing barbell overhead presses, we were doing maybe something in cables or with dumbbells, where we could position his body, his rib cage and all that kind of stuff in a position where the shoulders could move more easily, and without sounding overly focused on like optimization and biomechanics, just better like being scapular plane and all that basic stuff where we see things can articulate a little bit better, and we have less stress on the structures that were hurting.
And I
then
guess you'd also have
really
the recovery side of that, wouldn't you, as well? Because then obviously the loading would be less. He's then actually giving his body the opportunity to recover from, rather than constantly beating himself up like with his elbows.
Yeah, and the fun thing is he had already when it comes to his cardiovascular training, he already had the idea of if he had let's say he was doing a ski erg on his program, but the goal was to train his cardiovascular system in some way, shape, or form. If his elbows were hurting bad when he should do it, he knew his former coach, and I cannot remember exactly who, said that he could just do the bike instead, because you're still training the system. It's better than, of course, you need to incorporate the movements that you have to be good at, but it's better to be able to overload the cardiovascular system instead of beating yourself the head against the wall the entire time. That's the same principle I like to view machines or different variations than just the barbell lifts. If we can still train the adaptations we're going for, being it force production, hypertrophy, whatever, without it being interfered by pain, or as you said, interrupting the recovery process of maybe some tissues of the elbow. So yeah, we talk a lot about specificity all the time, but sometimes, so Dan Cleaver, he has this nice quote where he says a lot of good training modalities get sacrificed on the altar of specificity. So the movements doesn't always have to look exactly like the thing we have to do in competition for it to be effective. Sometimes it can be more effective if we look at it from a point of view of just being maybe force production, where that's why we have a hack squat available instead of a back squat. It's the same movement pattern. We don't get to practice the neurological efficiency in terms of how we are moving with a barbell, but we get a better environment for creating force, which is basically the scientific what we, from a scientific standpoint, means displaying strength is being able to display force production. Which will carry over.
I think, yeah, exactly. It still carries over. So I think the key principles for the listeners to take away from that is you've identified his limiters. So you know that at a certain threshold of work in his sport-specific movements, his elbows or his knees would limit his ability to overload his force production. So you've tweaked the exercise to remove that limiter, but still retain the training stimulus of generating more force in a similar movement pattern or similar part of the body. And I think when you're operating at such a high level, he would need to squat so much to challenge his force production that's the joints at some point will have to complain. So by being slightly less specific, you're able to retain the training stimulus without the limiter of the joint issues coming into play. So it's very elegant as a solution to keep him progressing without being held back by those limiting factors.
Yeah, and the very cool thing is that even though he was away from the barbell specific work for a long period of time, doing his strength progressions on a hack squat, when he came back and that was in quarterfinals, hasn't really been touching a barbell very much at high percentages. He lifts 8 kilos above his 1 rep max in front squat for 4 reps, which may be just a product of being better at creating force, but also getting the fatigue levels down and not having those niggles that may, even though how hardcore a person like Andre is, it will still limit your ability to lift something if you're hurting everywhere. Which is also a reason why it can be can be something clients can at least can auto regulate into their training, even though you have programmed a barbell back squat. If it doesn't feel right for the day, just do it at some lower percentages and then do your force production work on a hack squat if you have a good hack squat available. It doesn't really have to be. One thing I really take pride in, and I love teaching the people I work with, is how they can make good decisions in their training on their own instead of just following a plan like precisely as it's laid out in terms of percentages and exercise selection and all that kind of stuff. But that's not something you can write out in a program. That's something that takes human interaction, as we talked in the beginning. I have tried to see if I can write down those type of like solutions to people, but it's too hard to navigate on via text, for example, at least for me.
Yeah, it's a very complex process flow, and I think it's easy to underestimate the level of knowledge and understanding that goes into making those decisions that you're doing, where you're essentially chunking up all the potential benefits of a very complex exercise. Say in a back squat, there's so many things going on in your body that are getting stimulated, and you need to be able to remove those variables whilst keeping the desired training stimulus. So if it's the skill of the movement, if it's balance, if it's proprioception, if it's core bracing, if that's why you're doing it, like obviously to get better at back squatting, all of those things need to level up. But if something's off in any one of those areas, you still want to stimulate the force production aspect of the leg strength. So can you do that in a way that isn't held back by those other potentially limiting factors? And yeah, I think I'm imagining writing it in almost like an Excel if statement. It would be a very complicated, long formula to be able to adjust that without the years of knowledge and understanding that you've developed. But I love that notion of empowering your clients to self-adjust their programs and their movements.
And of course, I think there's a huge person variance in terms of who likes to incorporate this kind of stuff. There are a lot of athletes who are very high performing who never touched machines. It's just it's a tool, and if for someone like Andre, he felt like after the session he felt better because we have stimulated him maybe his neurologically in the hack squat, but because he has an enormous amount of work capacity, he didn't feel tired after a workout. And our sessions are like maybe 45 to 60 minutes sometimes of work, excluding his warm up or whatever he's doing before. And sometimes I see CrossFit athletes who want to improve their maximal strength numbers. Let's say they have 5x5 at programmed at 85, because that's what you see when you look at that corresponds with the load you need to use. But that's your 5 RM, and they do it. And then they have it's every 2 minutes or something. So they improve their work capacity, which is the things that they might be the best in the world at. They're not really pushing their ceiling of maximal load up. They're just improving the things that they're already the best in the world at, basically. So we tried, and I tried really to point that. We had phases having 6 to 10 minute pauses between triples on a hack squat, whereas that may be a little vulgar, maybe. That's something you would do if you were on a half tour level deadlifting, but it's, again, if you talk sport specific, when we then see a competition in CrossFit where you have maybe 15 minutes between your lifts, because if you saw at Dubai where they had to do some athletes had shorter rest periods, and I think Andre had 15 minutes between his lifts, and everyone was he was just sitting there looking down into the ground and seeing how everyone else was everyone else was doing, and they were every minute they were doing some lift because they wanted to neurologically and feel able to not get cold and do it. He'd done it before in the weight room, so he knew he could go in and lift an even heavier weight. That may be a psychological thing, but he was also used to having longer rest periods, which in theory should make him able to lift even heavier as long as he doesn't get very cold or lose focus. And then he made a PR. So
I love that, because I know, like, from more like my powerlifting background and with weightlifting, but like when it comes to powerlifting, you obviously don't know how many people are in your heat. You don't know how many people are going to be lifting when you're at those percentages, or like the weights are on the bar, and because obviously the bar's only going up, well, you might be waiting ages, and then you might be having quite a short, intense block. And I think something I really like there that you said about what Andre was doing was he was maintaining his focus. And I think, yes, okay, you might say start to cool down, but if you are accustomed to having those longer rests and you're doing them strategically, like you said, like using them as a way to kind of be able to switch back on. But the fact that he was able to stay focused on the task at hand, I think really obviously then showed that how much it helped him, because it's really easy to see, like at competitions and stuff, when you do look around, you see people like they're lost. They're like, what am I supposed to be doing right now? And as you said there, people are just lifting a rep here, lifting a rep there to stay switched on. I've got to stay engaged. And it's like looking for that quick fix. It's like, no, chill. Just give yourself the time and then go into it. But as you alluded to there, it's that's a skill in itself, to be able to actually just stay focused and not do anything. And think, I'm trusting the process here. I know I'm going to be fine. I just got to wait till it's my turn to go and get cracking.
Yeah.
Kasper, you mentioned 6 to 10 minute rests, and I think a lot of people listening might be shocked to hear that you could not do anything for 10 minutes in a gym session. But I think this is something that you kind of alluded to, that is often overlooked by CrossFitters, because everything they do is for time. They're always trying to pack in as much work as possible into short spaces. Could you elaborate on that and describe the disadvantage of that approach with your strength training when you're looking to build maximal strength? How that 2-minute rest in a 5x5 is actually going to hurt your progress, or not necessarily hurt your progress, but limit your progress as compared to the longer rest period.
Yeah. So if you're choosing to do 5x5 at around the 5 RM weight or just below, the first set you're going to do is going to be specific for strength. The rest of them, you're not. The force production you get in the first set will be higher than probably in the second and the third, because the acute fatigue you have in the session is going to be so high from the first set that your ability to produce more force is going to lower, which means that we need to know that the goal of the session is to get better at producing high amounts of force production inside the muscles, having the nervous system being able to activate more high threshold motor units, and peripherally the muscle fibers need to be able to contract. If we have short amounts of rest periods, then the neurological side of things will not, like if in terms of energy systems. And the funny thing is, like, CrossFitters, they know a lot about energy systems, but when it comes to strength, we kind of just sometimes ignore the fact that the type of energy systems for power and strength, we need a lot of recovery time. And I'd much rather prefer to have too long, quote unquote, too long rest between sets than too short. And then you can always do something at the end where you can, if you enjoy, like, it needs to feel hard. It's sometimes, as you know, when you program for people, you know what they're doing is enough for them to get better, but they feel like it's not enough. They're not trusting the process, because and it's the same for elite athletes and for people going at a freaking boot camp somewhere to lose fat. If they don't feel beat up after the session, then it couldn't have been a good session, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Because again, that's something that's going to drive us right into that wall of progression, because effort is not the problem, it's the organization of the training. So yeah, really, and it's the same principle for hypertrophy as it is for strength. Longer rest periods are superior to shorter rest periods. When it comes to hypertrophy, we can make up for it by doing more volume, but again, that's going to limit when you can have your frequency of training if you're choosing that route. So the way we train for hypertrophy and strength are almost the same, but for strength we just have more. We have more sets at fewer reps, meaning that we have more of the early repetitions that are where we can produce the most force. So we have more practice of force production being fresh. Whereas for hypertrophy, we flip it around a bit. So instead of doing 8 sets of 3, we do 3 sets of 8, where we need to the last 3 reps being very hard, where the bar velocity starts to slow down, and we create a lot of mechanical tension censoring in the muscle fibers, which then will lead to hypertrophy. So you can see it as like if you made a line down between hypertrophy on one side, strength on the other. Sometimes you can it's almost just flipping it around, doing 3 by 8 for hypertrophy, 8 by 3 for strength. You can do it there are a lot of nuances besides that, but that's basically how we can see it. And then being further from failure on your strength training and closer to failure on your hypertrophy training. That's if you do that, then you know how to build like a hypertrophy block and a strength block, basically, if that's all you know, instead of just adding more volume and doing shorter rest periods, chasing a pump, all those old school types of way of trying to create hypertrophy. So it's pretty similar. It's just in terms of how do we structure the training, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think the hypertrophy rest period might be even more surprising for a lot of listeners because of the classic pump chasing bodybuilding session. Could you explain in a little bit more detail why that? Because it feels great, if you have a shorter rest period, you're getting loads of blood in, you get a massive pump. But why does that limit hypertrophy as compared to a longer rest period?
So you can create hypertrophy via the more volume based training, more dense training, where you have short rest periods, higher reps. That's one thing that people tend to really like. So it's an easy sell for a lot of trainers, which is why exercises like hip thrusts, which is something you can really feel, and you get a good pump because it's a shortened exercise where you trap the blood, as you mentioned I think I heard another episode where you talked about like that pump buildup. It feels great, but you don't get quite as much like mechanical tension or stress or whatever you want to call it in the muscles. So you need a lot more volume of it. And the more volume you do, the more reps you do, the more neurologically fatigued you're going to get. So the further down the rep range we can get, doing like 6 to 8 reps is my preferred, 5 to 8 maybe. For someone who's more high skilled and we have good exercise selection, we can get more of what we call effective reps, which is the reps that are close to the failure point where you cannot complete any more repetitions, but we have less of the reps that are just there to make you tired, quote unquote. So that's what yeah, exactly. I was just gonna say it's what we in bodybuilding call junk volume. Yeah. So, but again, it's hard because that's the way people have always trained. Is like we just do a whole lot of stuff, but the intensity is just not there. And again, it's on a spectrum. Like because if you have someone like Andre, he could theoretically get away with just having 1 or 2 working sets for a muscle group, and I believe he could still create hypertrophic adaptations. Whereas what we read in the books, it's 10 to 20 sets often, and people, they will err on the side of 20 instead. Because then you can really feel like you're sore the next day, your DOMS is crazy, and you feel like, okay, I've really stimulated a lot, but it's more than a week until you can train the same muscle group. Before you even at the recovery point, the super compensation hasn't really occurred. You're maybe still in that alarm phase. And that's where we see the injuries start to build up over a long period of time. So it's really, but the metabolic side of training, like the pump training, it has its place, but, and it feels good. So it's good for compliance. But again, learning how to persuade people into and understand why they need to do their primary work with long rest periods. I often have that trick where I do, you can call it supersets or compound sets or whatever, where we have like a primary like compound exercise, which is for hypertrophy. I want them to have that 5 or 6 minute rest between their sets, but I know they're not going to just sit there and stare on the phone. So I program something in that's not, it could be just like tibialis anterior raise, or it could be some prehab work, or it could be an upper body exercise if we're doing a squat. that's not interfering as much. And then you can trick people a little bit into what you know is going to be the best for them.
I'm just thinking about a way you could do that with, like, say, back squats, and you can obviously it'll be might be a bit too complimentary, but you could have heavy back squat, then onto a bike erg for some like zone 2 spin out, and see about keeping the legs moving and just real slow as a way to kind of trick. Or obviously, if you didn't want it to affect it too much, you could say go to the ski or something like that, if you wanted to still keep them moving to some degree. Just as a thought of way to kind of challenge their ability to kind of not do anything. But I do really like that, and I think is like when it comes to the junk volume or getting those extra sets and where it does hurt, when we had Steve Fawcett on the podcast and spoke about the balance between the group program and JST, of you could have a squat cycle where everyone PBs, but it was boring compared to them maybe not PBing as much, but including more stuff in. And you're like, you do have to find that balance of what's fun and what do you get people leaving the session feeling like, fuck yeah, I'm ready for the next one, compared to this is going to work, just trust it. And they're like, fuck, especially with something like muscle building, because it does take a while. It does take a long time. Same with strength training. It's a commitment that you're in. So it's the little wins of the pump and stuff like that just make you think I'm on the right journey. So it's just a little way. So I guess obviously segment it in your week appropriately so it doesn't affect too much the big picture.
That goes back a little bit to what we talked about in the beginning, understanding the persons we're working with. Because if I told Andre, you just need to sit 10 minutes there into the ground, he would do it because he's dedicating himself to, he's going to follow that plan. But if you have someone who only has 45 minutes to train, then the solutions of where you talked about, they want to get stronger, but they also want to have improve their ability to do a ski erg, whatever. You can use that approach that you talked about. It's no way in optimal at all, but is it still good enough for them to progress on both parameters? Could be. But just knowing, like, not always chasing it. There's a lot of talk about like optimal training, and I love that. It's a good way of like learning what is optimal in a lot of different contexts. But we also need to understand that even with high level athletes, nothing is ever optimal. And I'm really concerned about people being concerned about being wrong on the internet, because when we see, and that's what I saw a lot when I started working with Andre, if people see him do like a pull down, like one arm pull down for lats or something, everyone will be like, that's non-specific, that's why you're doing all that kind of machine work. But you don't know the context of the moment and the session and the program or whatever, so it's very easy to point fingers in terms of that's not a good exercise selection for a CrossFit athlete, for example. But it may be because doing rope climbs is still too painful for the elbow, or that we want to put a little bit more muscle mass on the lats for some reason, to have more contractile tissue to pull himself up when he then gets to the rope climbs. But again, that's it. When I started out, my Instagram post was just crazy long, like continue in the comments, because I wanted to really make sure that everyone understand the context. But now I just come to a point where I'm not really going to do that now. I'm going to focus more on teaching the clients I do have, and that approach, trusting the process. And then when everyone else, they at one point want to get help, they can just reach out.
Yeah, exactly. I think when you're making such complex decisions with so much nuance, it's nearly impossible to fully articulate all the levels of consideration that you've applied into that one exercise selection for that one individual who's got so many different variables going on in their life, in their body, in their training. For somebody to say, like, he shouldn't be doing that because there's no single arm cable pull downs in CrossFit. It's so reductive, and it's very difficult to have that conversation and fully explain all the ins and outs of it. But yeah, I think, I really like that approach of yours. One thing you touched on just now was with hip thrusts or glute bridges, training muscles short. People like that, and it's one of the themes that comes through your content, is focusing on both training muscles long and short. I think a lot of people are aware of that, but they don't fully understand why those approaches exist. Could you explain to us why you would train a muscle long and short, please?
So it's something that's talked a lot about in the industry right now. Someone like Kasper Hansen, which is one I view like as one of my mentors, so to speak. He talked about it like many years ago, where a lot, and the same goes here, where a lot of people maybe ridiculing it a little bit. It was like, you don't have to focus on these types of details, but now it's the what everyone talks about, and I see that trend a lot. Whereas when something new comes up, people are ridiculing a little bit, and then you see in like 6 months time, people are starting to incorporate it as well, doing like pull arounds and all that kind of stuff. And it may not be like, a lot of it is not something that exclusively these guys have thought of. It has been existing for a long time, but they're not afraid, again, to look wrong in the eyes of the internet. And then we see the science part coming afterwards. Like, it's the same like with a lot of bodybuilding stuff, like people see and have made fun of earlier, and now we see that it might have some it might be applicable for a lot of stuff now. But that was like a side tangent. So we know that, or it seems like training muscles at a longer muscle length, not necessarily the longest length you have. If you think about like a Romanian deadlift, for example, where we can, depending on how we perform it, we can get quite a bit of stretch on the hamstrings or the glutes, and maybe even some adductors if we're standing a little bit wider. That's going to train the muscle in you can call it stretched or more elongated position, which is a place where both you have, like if it's a mid to long, you have more an ability to create contractile force because of the way the muscle fibers work. I'm not going to go into details with that now. And you also have some elements in the muscle that are being stretched, which is going to again help you create more force. And it's also what the theory says is going to stimulate some muscle group through stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So one could say, if you're training exclusively for hypertrophy, we would do only lengthened biased work. But I'm not quite sure that that's what the literature is showing 100% right now. But you can auto-regulate that in the training. Also, depending on when we're doing that lengthened bias stuff, we know that it creates more mechanical damage, which is not something we really want to have if we are high-performing athletes that need to train often. So limiting how much we're doing at it, or at least making sure that the things we're doing are very quality-based and and not too close to failure, is going to make sure that the athlete is not too sore. Whereas if we're doing, which is going to limit your ability to create force on a peripheral level instead of the neurological that we talked about with the rest periods. If you're training more so in a shortened range of motion, we cannot create as much force, and we don't really get that stretch, so it's less damaging. It's quite energy demanding, so it's an effective tool to train more frequently and practice movements and not being too sore. That's why we sometimes also like reverse band hack squats, and we throw in leg extension, all that kind of stuff, just again to be strong in the entire range of motion and getting a little bit more volume in without getting sore. And we can train more frequent if that's what we want. So there are an extreme amount of nuances to it, and what if we're going to put it down in a practical sense, what we've been doing with Andre is, when he get close to CrossFit Games, we are tapering the strength stuff, and then we are going down in the amount of accessory work we're doing in the lengthened, and then we're adding a bit more in the shortened. He likes walking around with a little bit more of a pump in some of his muscles. He feels like he can compete a little bit better. I'm not sure there's any science backing that up, other than you may have a little bit more glycogen in the muscle. But like having that feeling of not being skinny and fragile at the bottom of the squat, like having the calves and the hamstrings like pushing together, those are maybe some, in lack of better words, like soft skill type of stuff, like having big traps the bar can lay on, all that kind of stuff makes you feel more robust, more like a gorilla lifting instead of being fragile. But he can maintain a little bit more volume without being limited in his force production on a local level, because we're not really doing too much length and bias. We're just maintaining it, still hitting the high intensities because we're tapering. So instead of doing 8 sets of 3, now we may be just doing 4 sets of 2 on the same exercise, auto-regulating it in terms of it's to the same percentages. If he feels good, he can even add a little bit more. So his fatigue levels go down, both neurologically, locally, and his ability to create force and perform the exercises that he has to be good at competition are maintained, or even a little bit better, and confidence is high. So that's how we use it for like in an extreme. This is an extreme example, which like from regular gym goers wouldn't even think about it. We're just using lengthen and shorten work to not create redundancy in the training, meaning that if we have a squat at the beginning, instead of doing maybe a squat again, we're going to do maybe a leg extension if we have one available. If we're doing Romanians at the beginning, we're going to do some hamstring curls and glute bridges at the end, if there's time for it and if they want to do it. But it's just to make sure that it's not redundant, because we also know if we load the same range of motion all the time, we do create more mechanical damage than if we are expanding it out through a bigger part of the range of motion. For example, if you're doing lying hamstring curls, we know that it's the where we hit the head, like where the hamstrings are loaded most mechanically, are different than in a seated, for example. Also, a great knowledge if you're a physical therapist, if you have someone who has hamstring tendinopathy at the knee or up at the pelvis, then you can your exercise selection, you can make it a little bit more. It feels better for the client if you know how to load them without interfering too much with that tissue. So extremely amount of nuance.
Sorry, you finish. I'll just cut you off.
There's an extreme amount of nuances when it comes to how exercise selection.
Yeah, spot on. I think that all relies on you having a really strong anatomical understanding of where muscles are lengthened and shortened, so you can tweak the exercises to bias like distal versus proximal hamstrings. That's brilliant. And I think a nice segue into the next question we wanted to ask you, which was, what do you think in terms of big trends in the fitness industry are leading people astray? Where are the biggest mistakes being made in people's approach to training? We touched on sort of junk volume earlier. Do you think that's the biggest problem, or is there something more sinister that you can see?
I think it's a little bit difficult because I again live in my little bubble, a little sphere right now, where like the people I follow on Instagram are people who has a lot more knowledge about training. Like when coming across you guys, like it's not that when I see something you post, I'm like, no, that's something I would never do. And when I see someone else, like I'm not really. I do follow some accounts like Adam Meekins, for example, who are like his content are based around finding people who are maybe, but that's more so in terms of like pain and injury stuff. And that's where I see some, I wouldn't say maybe sinister stuff, but I see in my praxis that people are maybe sometimes afraid of movements, afraid of loading, afraid of like if someone has been to several healthcare providers, be it osteopaths, physical therapists, chiropractors, whatever, and have been told that they are not allowed to load something, they're not allowed to run or swim or whatever, that can really create some problems in terms of them creating fear avoidance or catastrophizing. If like I often get people who come in who they have back pain, and then they have automatically been told by a physio that, well, you might have a discus problem, but they have no way of really knowing it, because of course they can have they can suspect it via our testing, and again, like why paint that sinister painting in their head when we don't really even know it, instead of again having that positive approach. No matter how bad people have it, I always have the positive approach to them being better, because I know natural history and having a feeling of sense of coherence and getting the tools for them to get back to the level where they are. It can take 1 year, it can take 2 years, but I always tell that it's going to get better, instead of being like, well, you're going to experience pain again, but that's like saying the sun is going to rise tomorrow, instead of because they're going to experience pain. That's the biggest indicator. Like if you had pain somewhere before, you're probably going to experience again. But just say it in a way that that's normal. Like you're going to get a cold again, and you're not going to just lie down and don't do nothing because you get a little cold. So really too much focusing on the biomechanical stuff in terms of pain. Biomechanical stuff has a huge impact on pain often, but it's not like because people walk around with an anterior tilt that's why they're experiencing pain, because they've been walking around with that anterior tilt their entire life, for example. You can still correct people in how they move if you feel like the reason why they're experiencing some pinching or whatever is maybe because they're anterior tilting a bit too much going down in the squat or whatever. You can teach them what it means to correct the pelvic position and the ribcage position, and they may get that. And that's where understanding biomechanics, they get that quick fix acutely in the training, so now they trust your ability to help them. And then we can add on the layer of them not being so fragile as they may have thought that they were. So really that and it's so hard on Instagram. Like you guys are very movement focused, and you have like your courses, all that kind of stuff where you can teach people the nuances, and it's so hard to make short reels of something like how the shoulder is moving without losing so much nuance. And if you make a video that's 10 minutes long, people are not going to view it. So, and I think so it's mostly like in the things in terms of pain and all that kind of stuff where people maybe a little too, maybe my English is not the best, but you said sinister. It can become pretty sinister sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's spot on with the social media point that everyone optimizes for attention, and everyone talks about the hook. Like the first couple of seconds, you got to say something which really snaps people's attention away from whatever they were thinking about before. And the sensational stuff is what does best. So if we say, fix your back pain now, somebody with back pain is like, oh shit, I need to pay attention. And then they give one solution to one very specific scenario, which may or may not apply to their situation. And I think that's what that sort of feeds that negative cycle where people almost are conditioning themselves to expect that quick solution of like, I just need to stumble upon the right one exercise. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you will discover an exercise which really helps you that way. But I think the thinking is wrong in that we're trying to skip past the understanding phase of really getting to appreciate what's going on for that person. It might not be biomechanical, as you say, it might be more psychological or something else that's triggering the pain cycle. But it's kind of just the way the world's going now. Everybody wants those immediate results without having to put the legwork in of learning enough about the body to understand what's really going on. And then once we have a better understanding, you can plot out that pathway for them to say, yeah, you are going to get better. There are going to be ups and downs, but we are making progress towards where you want to go. So I fully agree with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I do feel that like with that social media stuff, it's only going to last a certain amount more time though, because it's getting to the point where people are realizing it's just like it doesn't work. And it's like, obviously you're always going to have the batch of new people of like, okay, yeah, I know I can find everything out here. But it's like, I honestly feel this is where like, even like the then use of AI. Now people want to be more specific. So rather than going on Google and searching, they want to go to AI and ask because they want a specific answer to the problem. And obviously we're getting more and more specific down the rabbit hole. And sometimes those responses are longer because it can't be a one word answer. It can't be a quick picture. It has to be this, or it might be that. And it's like, it helps you build a bigger picture. And I think it's just, the attention thing I don't think is going to change too quickly, but I think with the fact like podcasts and stuff like that and YouTube where people have the opportunity to break down the nuance, we can dive deeper into maybe like how the shoulder moves. As you said, you might not be able to say, but you might say, right, maybe this is, say, one thing the shoulder can do. And then if you want more information, check out my YouTube video, bang, where I break this down even more. So then you've got your next bit and so forth. So it's like obviously what we do like with the podcast, where we get obviously clips taken from the podcast, but a lot of the time it's just to try and bring ears to the podcast to actually hear the deeper conversation, not just the minute clip, because a lot of it you've missed out the nuance, and we are just trying to grab that bit of attention.
Yeah, and then the next level would be that people like come to your courses and can speak to you directly, or like by I'm not sure what if you have like consultations or whatever, and having it specific to their, like going back to the beginning, the person side of things. But you wouldn't be able to maybe help them in the same way if you didn't have the knowledge about all the biomechanic stuff. And you can also create some kind of trust through your social media, showing that you do have a knowledge base larger than that just telling people that it's going to be okay, even though that may be what they need to do. So yeah, it's everything on a spectrum.
Yeah, as always. Kasper, thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of benefit from the things that you've mentioned today. If people want to find out more about you, where should they look?
Yeah, thank you. And I think we touched upon a lot of things, but again, as always with these types of podcasts, you and me probably feel like we could have talked about this for several hours going forward and didn't even like touch base on most stuff. But yeah, just to make people realize that the things we say are not black and white. But yeah, if people want to reach out, most people do it through my Instagram, which is my name, Kasper Vinther, and then with an S at the end, because the username Kasper Vinther was taken. So a lot of people actually think that my last name has an S to it. It doesn't, but that's my Instagram. That's my Instagram handle, where you can reach out, and you can also, if you are interested in, even if you're interested in getting some help, just reach out through Instagram, or you can go to our webpage, which is a pretty long one. So it's nordicperformancetraining.com. If anyone from Denmark is listening, can always come by for a session. We have more therapists. That's basically it. Don't be afraid to reach out, and of course, Nordic also has an Instagram page you can visit. We try to, like with the social media stuff, I feel like I do it like in bursts, where I post stuff and then I burn out, and then I post stuff again, and then then I burn out again. But it's a very hard balance. But yeah, that's where you can. Don't be afraid to reach out if you have questions. Basically.
Brilliant. And I definitely recommend checking out Kasper's page. He does some really nice breakdowns of the whys and the biomechanics behind movements, and the very subtle tweaks to change the stimulus for the specific purpose. So definitely worth a look. And yeah, I completely agree. We could have talked for hours, but I think we'll have to get you back for a part 2 at some stage in the future and go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. But otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for your time, Kasper. Really appreciate the chat, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasper. That was awesome. Really, really enjoyed that. And it was really cool to kind of dive into the weeds there of some of that detail. So especially the rest period part. Like for me, like I've understood it when it comes to like the strength side of stuff, but with the bodybuilding, with the more muscle building approach to stuff, I've definitely erred on the side of shorter rest periods, because I do like that short-term gratification that, oh yeah, fuck, I feel like I've got a good pump. And it's funny because I think when I am trying to get a really good like muscle building stimulus, I do often have a longer rest than normal, but then I think, oh, I'm just being lazy. So it's funny just having, maybe actually I have been all right. Maybe I do need a little bit longer rest. It's not just being lazy. So I'm going to take your words, Kasper, and I'm going to try and put that into play. So thank you really again for coming on, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did. If you did enjoy it, please do share it on all your social medias, and don't forget to tag us all. All the links will be in the description box below. And as always, thank you for listening each and every week. We really do appreciate every single one of you. So we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.